Welcome, friend, to another journey together. Feel free to share where you are listening from and what time it is. There is something deeply moving about knowing that right now. Many of us are settling into our own quiet spaces with our busy thoughts, letting these timeless teachings gently guide us towards rest. Tonight, you will discover ancient wisdom that Buddhist masters have treasured for centuries to calm the busy mind and grow deep, healing peace. I am going to share a carefully chosen collection of deep Zen stories that have guided countless seekers toward inner stillness and the most peaceful rest of their lives. Each tale holds a sacred teaching that wakes up your spirit's natural ability to let go of tension and worry. What makes this different from ordinary relaxation techniques is that these timeless teachings work regardless of your experience with meditation. Even if your thoughts feel messy, even if you have struggled with restlessness before, the Buddha once observed, peace comes from inside. Do not look for it outside. Over the coming hours, you will understand exactly what this means and how to weave it into your own experience. As we explore stories of curious seekers, kind teachers, and life-changing moments, you will notice something beautiful unfolding. Your shoulders will begin to relax. Your breathing will naturally deepen, and you will find yourself gently settling into a state of profound calm. So make yourself comfortable now. Let your body sink fully into this moment. Take one slow breath with me, and as you let it out, know that you have just opened the door to a wisdom that has been patiently waiting for you across the centuries. Let's begin with our first story. At the foot of a mist-covered mountain in ancient Japan, there stood a small, simple hut made of wood and bamboo. This humble home belonged to Ryokan, a Zen master who had chosen to live with almost nothing. His things consisted of a single bowl, a worn robe, and a few sacred books. The walls of his hut were bare except for shadows cast by moonlight, and his floor held only a thin mat for sleeping. Yet those who visited him always remarked on the deep peace that filled this simple space. Ryokan spent his days in meditation, writing poetry, and walking in the surrounding forest. He found joy in the smallest things, the sound of rain on his roof, the sight of cherry blossoms, the warmth of sunlight through his window. His happiness seemed to spring from sources invisible to most people, as if he had discovered treasures hidden in plain sight. One evening, as crickets sang their night songs and the moon climbed high above the mountain peaks, Ryokan had gone to the village to visit a sick friend. While he was away, a thief crept up the mountain path toward his hut. The thief had heard stories about the famous Zen master and assumed that someone so respected must own valuable items, perhaps gold, silver, or precious treasures. The thief carefully examined the hut from outside, listening for any sounds within. Hearing nothing, he slipped inside through the unlocked door. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he began searching step by step through the small space. He looked in every corner, examined every shadow, checked under the sleeping mat, but there was nothing to steal. The hut contained not a single item of money value. As the thief stood there in confusion, he heard footsteps approaching on the mountain path. Panicking, he crouched in the darkest corner, hoping to hide until the person fell asleep. But when Ryokan entered, he immediately noticed the presence of another person. "You may have come a long way to visit me," Ryokan said gently, his voice free of alarm or anger. "And you should not return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift." The thief was confused. No one had ever responded to his presence with such kindness and generosity. He had expected fear, anger, or calls for help, but instead found himself facing a man who seemed genuinely concerned for his well-being. Ryokan began removing his robe, folding it carefully and extending it toward the confused intruder. The thief took the clothes with shaking hands and slipped away into the night, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer. He had never met anyone like this strange monk, who gave away his things to someone who had come to steal them. After the thief disappeared down the mountain path, Ryokan sat naked outside his hut, gazing up at the full moon. Its silver light bathed the mountainside in magical beauty, transforming the landscape into something wonderful and otherworldly. "Poor fellow," Ryokan whispered with genuine care. "I wish I could give him this beautiful moon." Buddha's wisdom reminds us health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth, faithfulness the best relationship. Here we discover a teaching about the nature of true plenty and the poverty of endless wanting. Why do we spend so much energy gathering possessions when the greatest treasures cannot be owned? Zen Buddhism points to our basic confusion about the source of happiness. We believe that security comes from having things. But Ryokan demonstrates that true security comes from needing nothing. We think wealth means owning things. But he shows us that wealth means the ability to give freely. This tale shows the deep difference between having and being. The thief came seeking objects he could carry away. But Ryokan possessed something that cannot be stolen, a deep happiness that springs from inside. The moon, a symbol of this inner light, shines on all equally and belongs to no one and everyone at the same time. Consider how much of our life energy goes toward protecting what we own versus growing what we are. We lock our doors, buy insurance, worry about theft or loss, yet rarely put the same effort into developing the inner qualities that create lasting happiness. Ryokan's response to the thief reveals someone who has learned the truth, that generosity multiplies joy, while keeping things to yourself makes it smaller. The Buddha said, "If you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it in some way." Ryokan's immediate impulse to give his clothes to the thief was not just kindness. It was wisdom. He understood that holding on to possessions creates separation between people, while giving creates connection and dissolves the barriers between self and others. Zen Master Dogen taught that to give is to receive. This puzzle becomes clear when we examine our own experience. Think of times when you have given something meaningful to another person. Often the joy of giving is greater than any pleasure you might have gotten from keeping the item. The act of giving itself becomes the gift we receive. The moon in this story represents what Buddhism calls our Buddha nature, the natural wholeness and light that exists within all beings. Like the moon, this inner light cannot be stolen, hoarded, or made dimmer by sharing. In fact, it grows brighter the more freely we allow it to shine. Ryokan's wish to give the moon to the thief expresses his desire to share this ultimate treasure, the recognition of our own complete nature. In our shopping culture, we are constantly told that happiness comes from getting more. But Ryokan's example suggests the opposite, that happiness comes from needing less and giving more. This does not mean we should live in poverty, but rather that we can hold our possessions lightly, seeing them as tools for helping others rather than sources of identity or security. The thief left with clothes, but missed the greater treasure, the example of a human being who had discovered unshakable peace through inner simplicity. He took something that could be worn out or lost, but walked away from something that could have changed his entire life. Tonight, as you look at the moon or simply rest in the quiet of this moment, can you sense the wealth that cannot be stolen? The breath moving through your body, the awareness that understands these words, the capacity for love and wonder that exists regardless of your situation. As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace. The peace that Ryokan showed is available to each of us when we stop grabbing and learn to rest in our own natural completeness. Now let us explore a Zen story that takes place in a quiet monastery where 20 monks and one nun named Eshan practiced meditation together under the guidance of their Zen master. The morning air was crisp with the scent of incense, and the sound of wooden bells echoed softly through the stone hallways. Eshan moved through her daily practice with graceful presence, her shaved head catching the golden light that streamed through the temple windows. Despite her plain robes and simple appearance, Eshan possessed a natural beauty that drew the attention of several monks. They found themselves stealing glances during meditation, their minds wandering from their breath to thoughts of her gentle movements and calm face. One monk, particularly in love, felt his heart race whenever she passed by. The weight of his feelings grew heavier each day until he could no longer contain them. In the quiet of his room, he wrote her a letter confessing his love and asking for a private meeting. His hand shook as he folded the paper, and he slipped it to her after the evening meal. He watched her face carefully as she read it, searching for any sign that she felt the same way, but Eshan's expression remained unchanged, calm as still water. She folded the letter quietly and continued with her evening practice, giving no answer. The following day, the master delivered his regular teaching to the group. The hall was filled with the soft rustle of robes and the gentle rhythm of breathing together. When the lecture finished, Eshan rose from her cushion with careful grace. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. She looked directly at the monk who had written the letter, her gaze steady and kind. "If you really love me so much," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "come and hug me now." The monk's face turned bright red. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. The other monks shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others watching with fascination. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. In that instant, the monk understood. His love fell apart under the light of truth, revealed as nothing more than desire, fantasy, and attachment. Buddha's wisdom reminds us you yourself as much as anybody in the entire universe deserve your love and affection. What comes from this story is a deep teaching about the difference between true love and attachment disguised as love. Eshen's response cut through the monk's romantic illusion with the sharp blade of reality, revealing the conditional nature of what he called love. Why do we so often confuse desire with love? Zen Buddhism points to the ego's habit of projecting our needs onto others, creating detailed fantasies about connection, while remaining fundamentally focused on ourselves. The monk's love was based on Eshen's appearance and his own longing, not on genuine care for her well-being or spiritual growth. True love, as Buddhism teaches, is unconditional kindness that seeks nothing in return. Consider how often we attach the word love to experiences that are actually about possession, control, or satisfying our own needs. We say we love someone, but what we really mean is that their presence makes us feel good. Their attention makes us feel valid, or their beauty pleases us. This is not love but attachment, and attachment inevitably leads to suffering. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi observed, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This puzzle applies beautifully to love. We must love others as they are, not as we wish them to be, while at the same time supporting their growth and awakening. The monk's letter revealed his desire to possess Eshen privately, to have her fit his romantic fantasy, rather than honoring her path as a devoted student. Eshen's response demonstrated what Zen calls fierce compassion, the willingness to cut through confusion, even when it causes temporary discomfort. By exposing the monk's attachment publicly, she offered him and everyone present a teaching about the nature of real love versus romantic imagination. True love acts for the beloved's highest good, even when that means destroying pleasant illusions. In our daily lives, we can practice this judgment by examining our relationships honestly. When we feel attracted to someone, are we seeing them clearly or projecting our needs onto them? When we offer help or affection, are we genuinely serving their well-being or seeking something in return? The Buddha taught that loving kindness begins with self-awareness and extends outward through increasingly widening circles of genuine care. Tonight, as you reflect on the relationships in your life, can you tell the difference between love and attachment? Can you offer care that asks nothing in return, that honors others' freedom and spiritual journey? As the Buddha taught, hatred is never calmed by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred calmed. This is a law eternal. True love dissolves the boundaries between self and others, creating space for real connection to grow. Let us now turn to a tale that challenges our understanding of spiritual progress and genuine kindness. This is the story of the old woman's compassion test. In the mountains of ancient China, there lived an elderly woman whose generosity knew no limits. For over 20 years, she had supported a monk's spiritual practice with steady dedication. She had built him a simple hut with her own hands, using wood from the surrounding forest, and brought him food daily so he could devote himself entirely to meditation. Her worn hands had kneaded countless loaves of bread. Her bent back had carried heavy loads up the mountain path, all out of faith that her support was nurturing genuine spiritual development. As the years passed, the woman began to wonder about the monk's progress. She watched him daily in his meditation pose, noting his peaceful manner and disciplined routine. Yet something stirred within her, a question that grew stronger with each passing season. What kind of wisdom had come from all these years of practice? What depth of kindness had he grown? Had her decades of support truly contributed to his spiritual awakening, or had she merely enabled comfortable hiding from the world? The old woman was not one to let questions rot. She was a practical person who believed that spiritual development should show in one's response to life's difficulties, not just in the ability to sit peacefully in isolation. She created a test that would reveal the true nature of the monk's achievement. She approached a young woman from the village, someone known for her warmth and natural kindness. "I need your help," the old woman explained. "Go to the monk and hug him, show him real affection. Then ask him suddenly, 'What now?' I want to see how he responds to this unexpected situation." The young woman agreed. Curious about this unusual request, she made her way up the mountain path to the monk's hut, her heart beating with nervous excitement. When she arrived, she found the monk in his usual meditation pose, still as a statue. Without hesitation, she approached him and hugged him warmly, her touch conveying genuine human connection and affection. "What now?" she asked softly, looking into his eyes. The monk's response came immediately, his voice cold and distant. "An old tree grows on a cold rock in winter. Nowhere is there any warmth." The young woman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She returned to the old woman and told her exactly what the monk had said. The old woman's face darkened with disappointment and anger. "To think I fed that fellow for 20 years, she exclaimed. "He showed no consideration for your need, no willingness to explain your condition. He need not have responded to passion, but at least he should have shown some compassion." Without hesitation, the old woman marched up the mountain to the monk's hut and burned it to the ground. As the Buddha observed, compassion is not religious business. It is human business, it is not luxury. It is essential for our own survival. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding that true spiritual development must include the capacity for real human connection and appropriate response to others' needs. Why do we sometimes mistake spiritual detachment for spiritual success? Zen Buddhism warns against what it calls Zen sickness, the tendency to use spiritual concepts as shields against real engagement with life. The monk had achieved a kind of calmness, but it was cold and lifeless, lacking the warmth of genuine kindness. The old woman's test revealed a crucial difference between avoiding reality and real realization. The monk had learned to remain undisturbed by temptation, but he had not learned to respond to human need with appropriate kindness. His poetic response about the cold tree revealed someone who had become emotionally frozen rather than spiritually free. Consider how often we encounter people who use spiritual concepts to avoid real engagement. They speak of detachment while remaining emotionally unavailable. They talk about non-attachment while showing indifference to others' suffering. They quote sacred texts while showing little practical wisdom in their daily interactions. Zen Master Dogen taught to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be connected by all things. True spiritual development doesn't create distance from life, but deeper engagement with it. The monk had studied himself in isolation, but had not learned to forget himself in service to others. The old woman's anger was not personal meanness, but justified anger at wasted opportunity. She had invested decades in supporting someone's spiritual growth, only to discover that her generosity had enabled spiritual stuckness rather than real development. Her burning of the hut was a teaching itself, a dramatic demonstration that comfortable spiritual practice without genuine kindness is ultimately worthless. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us that the highest spiritual achievement includes skillful means, the ability to respond properly to each situation with wisdom and compassion. The monk could have acknowledged the young woman's courage in approaching him, offered a gentle explanation of his vows, or shown appreciation for her humanity while keeping his boundaries. Instead, he offered only cold poetry that dismissed her as if she were an annoyance. Tonight, as you consider your own spiritual development, can you examine whether your practice increases your capacity for genuine connection or creates barriers to real engagement? Does your spiritual understanding make you more available to others' needs or more removed from them? The Buddha taught, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. True spiritual progress is measured not by our ability to remain undisturbed, but by our capacity to respond to life with wisdom, warmth, and genuine care. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, we encounter a story about the transformation of fear into power. This is the tale of great waves. In the early days of the Meiji era, when Japan was opening to the world and old traditions met new challenges, there lived a wrestler whose name was Onami, meaning great waves. His body was magnificent, broad shoulders, powerful arms, and legs like tree trunks. In the private training halls, he was unstoppable. He could throw opponents twice his size, and had even defeated his own teacher in practice matches. His technique was perfect, his strength legendary among those who knew him personally. But when Onami stepped into the public ring, everything changed. The moment he felt the eyes of the crowd upon him, his confidence disappeared like morning mist. His powerful frame would begin to shake. His breathing would become shallow and quick, and his mind would fill with doubt and self-consciousness. In these public contests, even his own students could defeat him. The very students he had trained and beaten in private would throw him easily when crowds gathered to watch. This contradiction tortured Onami. He knew his strength had proven his skill countless times. Yet he could not understand why his power left him when it mattered most. The shame of these public defeats grew heavier with each match. He began to avoid competitions, retreating into the safety of private practice. But this only deepened his frustration. Finally, Onami decided to seek help from a Zen master. He had heard of Hakuju, a wandering teacher known for his unusual methods and deep insight. When Hakuju arrived at a nearby temple, Onami hurried to meet him. He bowed deeply before the master and poured out his troubles. "I am strong in private, but weak in public," Onami confessed. "My body doesn't change, but my spirit fails me. I don't understand why this happens or how to overcome it." Hakuju listened carefully, studying the restless face and posture. He could see the genuine strength beneath the surface anxiety, the potential power trapped by fear. "Great Waves is your name," the teacher said thoughtfully. "So stay in this temple tonight. Imagine that you are those giant waves. You are no longer a wrestler who is afraid. You are those huge waves sweeping everything before them, swallowing all in their path. Do this and you will be the greatest wrestler in the land." With these words, the teacher retired, leaving Onami alone in the meditation hall. The wrestler sat in the traditional pose, trying to follow the instruction, but his mind wandered to many different things. Past defeats, future worries, the faces of the crowd, the weight of expectations. Gradually, however, he began to feel something shift within him. As the night deepened, Onami's imagination began to take hold. He stopped thinking about wrestling and started becoming the waves themselves. He felt the vast power of the ocean rising within him, the unstoppable force of water in motion. The waves in his mind grew larger and larger, crashing through the temple, sweeping away the flower arrangements, overwhelming even the Buddha statue in the shrine. By dawn, in his meditation, the entire temple had become nothing but the ebb and flow of a huge sea. When morning came, Hakuju found Onami still sitting in meditation, a slight smile playing on his lips. The wrestler's entire presence had changed. There was a depth and power about him that hadn't been there before. The teacher gently patted his shoulder. "Now nothing can disturb you," Hakuju said with satisfaction. "You are those waves. You will sweep everything before you." That very day, Onami entered a wrestling contest. When he stepped into the ring, he no longer saw the crowd or felt their judgment. He was the ocean itself, vast and powerful and completely natural in its strength. He won every match easily. From that day forward, no one in all of Japan could defeat him. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." This ancient wisdom lights up the deep change that occurred in Onami's mind. He discovered that his greatest enemy was not any outside opponent, but his own limiting beliefs and fear of judgment. Why do we often perform far below our actual abilities when others are watching? Zen Buddhism explains this by looking at self-consciousness. The way our attention becomes divided between the task at hand and our concern about how we look to others. When we worry about our image, we lose connection with our natural abilities and real power. Look deeply at your own experience. How many times have you known exactly what to do in private only to stumble when performing publicly? Perhaps you've experienced this giving presentations, having difficult conversations, or doing creative work. The skills and knowledge remain the same, but our relationship to them changes when we feel watched and judged. Onami's transformation illustrates what Zen calls beginner's mind, the state of openness and natural action that exists before self-consciousness creates interference. Children often show this quality, doing complex physical feats without worry, because they haven't yet learned to doubt themselves or fear judgment. The wave meditation that Hakuju prescribed worked because it shifted Onami's identity from a wrestler who might fail to a natural force that simply is. Waves don't worry about their performance or apologize for their power. They simply express their nature completely and without holding back. This identification with natural forces is a common Zen technique for accessing our built-in strength and wisdom. Zen teacher Alan Watts observed, "The art of living is neither careless drifting on the one hand, nor fearful clinging to the past on the other. It consists in being sensitive to each moment, in regarding it as utterly new and unique." Anami learned to approach each wrestling match as a completely fresh expression of his wave nature without the burden of past defeats or future expectations. The deeper teaching here shows us that confidence is not something we build up or get from outside. It's our natural state when we stop interfering with ourselves through too much self-monitoring and judgment. True confidence emerges when we identify with something larger than our small, worried self. Whether that's the ocean's power, the sky's vastness, or simply our built-in Buddha nature. Tonight, as you consider areas of your life where fear holds you back from expressing your full potential, can you experiment with Hakuju's method? What natural force might you identify with to access your real power? Perhaps you are the mountain's steadiness in difficult conversations, the fire's warmth in creative expression, or the wind's freedom in taking risks. As Buddha taught, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. By changing the story we tell ourselves about who we are, we can transform our entire experience of life. Let us now turn to an ancient story about the complex relationship between love, judgment, and real spiritual realization. This is the life of Shunkai. In the flowering gardens of ancient Japan, there lived a woman whose beauty was matched only by the intensity of her spiritual seeking. Shunkai, also known as Satsu, moved through the world like a flame that both lit up and sometimes burned everything it touched. Her large, expressive eyes held depths that seemed to contain both infinite gentleness and strong determination. Even in simple robes, she possessed a natural grace that drew people to her like moths to candlelight. From early youth, Shunkai's path was marked by struggle against normal expectations. She was forced into marriage against her wishes when still young, her family prioritizing social plans over her personal desires. The experience of being treated as property rather than a person ignited in her a rebellion that would shape her entire life. When this marriage ended, she pursued her education with passionate intensity, studying philosophy at the university, where her brilliant mind flourished alongside her captivating presence. Love seemed to follow Shunkai wherever she went, but not the simple romantic love of fairy tales. Her love was complex, many-sided, sometimes destructive. She fell in love with ideas, with people, with the very intensity of existence itself. At university, students and professors alike found themselves drawn to her magnetic presence. When philosophy no longer satisfied her deep spiritual hunger, she turned to Zen Buddhism, hoping to find in ancient wisdom what book study could not provide. But even in the temple, the same patterns emerged. The Zen students supposedly focused on rising above earthly attachments found themselves attached to her. Her very presence seemed to stir up the desires and conflicts that meditation was meant to resolve. Yet beneath the surface attraction, there was something genuine in Shunkai's spiritual seeking that her brothers in the temple recognized and respected. In Kyoto at the sub-temple of Kenin, Shunkai finally found what seemed like a spiritual home. Her sincerity impressed the monks, and one in particular became her spiritual companion, helping her navigate the complexities of Zen practice. For a time, it seemed she had found the balance between her passionate nature and the disciplined path of awakening. However, the temple's abbot, Mokurai, known as Silent Thunder, maintained strict traditional standards. He was a man who kept the ancient rules with fierce dedication and expected the same from others. When he discovered monks' wives in his temples, he would chase them away with a broom. But his efforts seemed only to multiply the problem he was trying to solve. The wife of the head priest, watching Shunkai's growing influence and the praise her earnestness received, felt a jealousy that ate at her like acid. Unable to bear the comparison between her own normal devotion and Shunkai's intense spiritual seeking, she began spreading rumors about Shunkai and her male companion. The poison of gossip worked its way through the temple community like fire through dry grass. As a consequence of these rumors, Shunkai's friend was kicked out of the temple, and she herself was removed from the community that had finally seemed to understand her. Standing in the temple courtyard with her few possessions, Shunkai felt the familiar pain of rejection, but this time it was mixed with justified anger. I may have made the mistake of love, she thought, but the priest's wife shall not remain in the temple, either if my friend is to be treated so unfairly. That night, driven by a fury that consumed rational thought, Shunkai took a can of fuel and set fire to the 500-year-old temple. The ancient wooden structure with its irreplaceable history and sacred items burned to the ground. In the morning, she found herself in police custody, watching the ashes of her spiritual home smoke in the dawn light. A young lawyer, moved by her story and perhaps by her beauty, tried to help reduce her sentence. But Shankai, with the same intensity that had driven her to both spiritual seeking and destructive action, refused his help. "Do not help me," she told him. "I might decide to do something else which would only imprison me again." 7 years in prison followed. Even there, her magnetic presence continued to work its strange magic. The 60-year-old warden fell under her spell. But when she was finally released, the world had no place for her. Everyone saw only the scandal, the crime, the woman who had burned down a sacred temple. Even the Zen community, which preached enlightenment and compassion, shunned her completely. Shankai discovered the painful truth that spiritual communities often struggle with their own shadows. The same people who spoke of universal Buddha nature and non-judgment turned away from her in disgust. Her own family disowned her. She grew sick, poor, and weak, surviving on the edges of a society that had totally rejected her. In her final years, she found some peace through a Shinshu priest who taught her to call upon the Buddha of love. In this simple practice, she finally found the acceptance and forgiveness that had escaped her throughout her stormy life. She died still beautiful, still young at barely 30, her potential largely unused due to the judgments and limits of her time. Before her death, she wrote her own story, hoping perhaps to earn enough to survive, but also to leave a record of a life that refused to follow expectations. Some of her story reached a woman writer, and through her, the Japanese people learned of Shankai's journey. Those who had rejected, lied about, and hated her now read of her life with tears of sadness. As the Buddha understood, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. The deeper teaching here shows us how society's judgments often prevent us from recognizing the sacred in unexpected forms. Shankai's passionate nature, which could have been a source of great spiritual power, was channeled into destruction simply because she found no community wise enough to help her turn her intensity into wisdom. Why do we so often reject those who embody the very qualities we claim to value? Zen Buddhism reveals our tendency to prefer comfortable, predictable spirituality over the raw transformative power of real awakening. Shankai's love was too intense, her seeking too passionate, her responses too human for a community that preferred the appearance of rising above to its messy reality. This tale points us toward understanding that real spiritual life includes all of our humanity, the beautiful and the ugly, the inspiring and the destructive. Shankai's mistake was not her capacity for love, but her inability to find wise guidance for using that love constructively. The community's mistake was not their following of rules, but their failure to extend compassion to someone whose spiritual journey didn't fit normal forms. In Japanese culture, there is a practice called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the repaired object more beautiful than the original. Shankai's life was like a broken vessel that was never offered the gold of true understanding and acceptance. Instead of being transformed through wise guidance, her cracks became breaks that ultimately shattered her life. The Buddha taught, if you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own way. Those who rejected Shankai missed the opportunity to be lit by her fierce dedication to truth, however imperfectly expressed. Her story reminds us that the path to awakening is rarely smooth or normal, and that our capacity to hold space for others' struggles directly reflects our own spiritual maturity. Tonight, as you consider the outcasts and difficult people in your own life, can you look beyond their actions to the spiritual longing that might be driving them? Can you see past society's judgments to the Buddha nature that exists even in those who have made terrible mistakes? As Buddha said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Shankai's life challenges us to extend this love, not just to the obviously good, but to those whose seeking has led them down dark paths. In learning to embrace the full range of human spiritual experience, we discover the compassion that transforms both ourselves and our world. As we continue our journey, let us now turn to a story about acceptance and the art of happiness. This is the shepherd's wisdom. Along a dusty mountain road where wildflowers dotted the hillsides, a tired traveler met a shepherd tending his flock. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, and clouds gathered on the horizon, creating an uncertain sky that could promise either gentle rain or burning heat. The shepherd sat peacefully on a smooth rock, watching his sheep graze happily among wild grasses. His face bore the calm expression of one who had spent countless seasons under open sky, learning lessons that only nature can teach. There was something in his manner, a quality of unshakable peace that drew the traveller's attention. "Good morning, friend," the traveller called out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What kind of weather are we going to have today?" The shepherd looked up with eyes that held mountain stream clarity and smiled with genuine warmth. "The kind of weather I like," he replied simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. The traveller paused, confused. He had expected a practical forecast that would help him plan his day. Instead, he received what seemed like confusing reasoning, offering no useful information. "How do you know it will be the kind of weather you like?" the traveller pressed, his voice carrying frustration mixed with curiosity. The shepherd's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the vast sky above them, where clouds and clear patches moved in their eternal dance. "Having found out, sir, that I cannot always get what I like," he said, with the patience of one who had learned life's most essential lesson, "I have learned to always like what I get. So I am quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like." The traveller stood in silence, the deep simplicity of this wisdom settling into his understanding like seeds finding rich ground. Here was a man who had discovered something that all the weather predictions in the world could not provide: complete freedom from the worry of uncertainty. As the Buddha observed, attachment is the root of suffering. What comes from this story is the recognition that true happiness comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from changing our relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Why do we exhaust ourselves trying to arrange life according to our preferences rather than learning to find peace within whatever life presents? The shepherd represents what Zen calls great acceptance, not passive giving up, but the deep wisdom that recognizes resistance to reality as the main source of suffering. When we fight against what is, we create an internal war that drains our energy and blocks our capacity for happiness. When we learn to align ourselves with reality as it unfolds, we discover the tremendous peace that comes from swimming with the current rather than against it. Consider how much mental and emotional energy we spend each day fighting circumstances beyond our control: traffic jams, weather that doesn't match our plans, people who don't behave as we think they should. Each resistance creates a small tightness in our awareness, a tiny rebellion against reality that builds up into constant dissatisfaction. The shepherd's approach doesn't mean becoming passive or ceasing to have preferences. We can still hope for sunny days while fully accepting rainy ones. We can work toward goals while finding peace when outcomes differ from expectations. The key lies in holding our preferences lightly rather than allowing them to decide our happiness. Zen Master Senkan wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." This doesn't suggest getting rid of all desires, but rather not allowing those desires to become demands that reality must fulfill for us to be okay. Look deeply at your own patterns of resistance. How often do you find yourself arguing with reality, wishing circumstances were different, or believing you'll be happy when things change? This tension is optional, not because you should suppress your desires, but because you can learn to hold them more wisely. The Buddha taught that attachment doesn't mean caring deeply about things. It means making our inner peace depend on external circumstances arranging themselves according to our instructions. The shepherd cares about his flock and appreciates comfort, but his basic happiness doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, both pleasant and challenging, can you find the shepherd's secret within your own mind? What if happiness isn't waiting for better circumstances, but is available right now through a shift in viewpoint? As the Buddha taught, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The shepherd discovered that when we stop demanding that life fit our expectations, we find the freedom to enjoy life exactly as it presents itself. Let us now turn to a tale about the nature of seeking and finding. This is the master sculptor's discovery. In a busy stone quarry beneath towering mountains, a master sculptor moved among the marble blocks with the practiced eye of one who had spent decades pulling beauty from stone. The morning sun cast golden light across the quarry, lighting up countless blocks that seemed to whisper their stories to him. "How?" he would say, running his weathered hands across smooth surfaces. "There is a heroic figure locked in that piece, and a saint trapped inside that other one." His reputation had grown precisely because of this gift. His ability to sense the true nature of every stone, to see beyond raw material to its real form waiting to be released. But on this morning, the sculptor's heart carried a different weight. For over 40 years, he had been searching for something special, the perfect block from which he could create his masterpiece, a glorious statue of the Buddha. His energy was fading now, and still this hidden Buddha block remained hidden from him. He had traveled to great quarries around the world, talked to experts, hired specialists to search remote areas. Yet nowhere could he find that one perfect slab that would allow him to release the most perfect likeness of Buddha. Feeling the weight of his lifelong quest, the sculptor sought comfort from a local Zen priest who headed a small temple at the end of his street. The temple was modest with a peaceful courtyard where a stone well sat surrounded by carefully tended moss. "Master," the sculptor said, bowing deeply, "I have searched for 40 years for the perfect stone from which to carve the Buddha. My life's work remains incomplete." The priest listened with kind eyes, then smiled gently. "No problem," he said with such simplicity that the sculptor felt both confused and hopeful. "Do you mean you can tell me where I might find the perfect material from which I can release the Buddha of my dreams?" The sculptor asked, excitement rising in his voice. "Of course." "Where?" The priest raised his hand and pointed across the courtyard. "Over there," he said, pointing to the stone well. The excited sculptor hurried to the well and looked down into the still, dark water. There, looking back at him with the same questioning eyes, the same lined face marked by years of searching, was his own reflection. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, if you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? The deeper teaching here shows us that what we seek most desperately often lies not in some distant place or perfect circumstance, but in the very ground of our own being. Why do we exhaust ourselves searching everywhere except within? Zen Buddhism reveals that we become so focused on the object of our search that we forget to examine the searcher. The sculptor had examined thousands of stones, traveled countless miles, yet never considered that the very mind doing the seeking was itself the perfect material for awakening. Consider how often throughout your day you put off happiness, waiting for better circumstances. "I'll be happy when I get the promotion, find the right partner, when conditions are finally perfect." This is seeking the Buddha block everywhere except in the reflection looking back at us right now. Zen Master Huangpo taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." The sculptor's deep realization wasn't that he needed to become something different, but that he needed to recognize what he already was. The perfect material for expressing Buddha nature isn't found in external circumstances, but in the awareness that recognizes, seeks, and creates. The well represents the still point within consciousness where seeking ends and finding begins. When we stop looking outward and look into the depths of our own awareness, we discover that the one who seeks and the sought are the same. In Zen practice, we speak of original face, the essential nature that exists before conditioning. This original face isn't hidden in some special place. It's looking back at us from every mirror, every moment of genuine presence. Tonight, as you encounter the reflection of your own seeking mind, can you recognize the Buddha nature that has been with you all along? Perhaps it appears in your capacity for wonder, your longing for truth, or simply in the awareness that notices these very words. As the Buddha taught, look within. You are the Buddha. The masterpiece you have been seeking isn't waiting for perfect materials. It's waiting for the recognition that the artist, the art, and the awareness that appreciates beauty are all expressions of the same essential nature. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the dance between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, thoughtful man who seemed to understand something deep about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river rose with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky canyon below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging water and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who saw his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in pain as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the bottom of the waterfall, they saw the old man coming out of the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had seen. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and thought about their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I moved with the water, not against it. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself. And this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a lucky accident. They had seen a demonstration of a deep principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents, rather than exhausting ourselves in useless fighting against forces beyond our control. Why do we naturally fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will. But this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life fit our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Consider your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach. Not passive giving up, but conscious adaptation that keeps our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This does not mean accepting harmful situations or giving up our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances fit our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through moving with things rather than force. I said, hatred does not cease by hatred but only by love. This is the eternal rule. This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction, rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to move with the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to keep your center while flowing with forces you cannot change? Discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them. Buddha's wisdom reminds us in the end just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything, while keeping our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. Our next story reveals the slow poison of habitual negativity and the freedom found in happiness. This is the lesson of the monastery and the monk who never stopped complaining. In a remote mountain monastery known for its strict discipline and deep silence, a community of monks devoted themselves to deep spiritual practice. The monastery followed an ancient vow of silence, understanding that constant talking often distracts the mind from inner thinking and genuine insight. For years at a time, the monks would practice in complete quiet, finding peace in the absence of unnecessary words. However, this particular monastery had one unusual tradition. Every 10 years, each monk was allowed to speak exactly 2 words to the head monk. This brief allowance acknowledged that sometimes practical concerns or spiritual insights might need to be communicated while still maintaining the essential discipline of silence that supported their practice. One young monk entered this monastery with sincere intentions and dedicated himself to the demanding schedule of meditation, work, and study. But from the very beginning, he struggled with unhappiness. The simple rooms felt uncomfortable, the plain food seemed not enough, and the hard schedule challenged his preferences at every turn. After his first 10 years of practice, he went to the head monk for his allowed communication. The elder looked at him with kind, expectant eyes, ready to hear whatever wisdom or insight the decade of silent practice might have produced. "Bed hard," the monk said, using his 2 precious words to express his main complaint about the sleeping arrangements. "I see," the head monk replied gently, making note of the comment, but offering no judgment or solution. The monk returned to his silent practice, but his unhappiness only seemed to deepen over the next decade. Instead of using the years to grow acceptance and inner peace, he spent his time dwelling on various discomforts and problems he saw in the monastery's provisions. His meditation became increasingly upset as his mind practiced complaints he couldn't say out loud. When his second opportunity to speak arrived after another 10 years, he again approached the head monk. The elder greeted him with the same patient attention, curious to see how 2 more decades of practice might have influenced the monk's perspective. "Food stinks," the monk declared, using his allocated words to express his ongoing unhappiness with the simple vegetarian meals provided by the community. "I see," the head monk responded with unchanged calmness, observing this second expression of complaint without surprise or criticism. Another 10 years passed, during which the monk's internal negativity continued to grow. Instead of finding freedom through spiritual practice, he had used 3 decades to perfect the art of mental complaining. His silent years were filled not with peace and insight, but with constant internal criticism of his circumstances. When his third opportunity for speech arrived, the monk appeared before the head monk with obvious agitation. 3 decades of built-up unhappiness had finally reached its breaking point. "I quit," he announced strongly, using his 2 words to express his final decision to abandon the path he had never truly embraced. The head monk looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Well, I can see why," he replied compassionately. "All you have ever done is complain. The Buddha taught, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This teaching reveals how the monk's 30 years of practice had actually strengthened the very patterns that caused his suffering rather than dissolving them. Why do we sometimes use spiritual practice to perfect our unhappiness rather than rise above it? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to bring our habitual mental patterns into any environment, then blame external circumstances for our internal states. The monk never truly engaged with the practice. He simply endured it while keeping his resistance. The monastery's conditions weren't the source of the monk's suffering. His attitude toward those conditions was. Countless other monks had found peace, insight, and deep happiness in the exact same circumstances. The difference lay not in what they experienced, but in how they related to their experience. Consider your own patterns of complaint and dissatisfaction. How much of your mental energy goes toward rehearsing complaints about circumstances you cannot change? The monks spent 30 years of precious life force focused on bed hardness and food quality, instead of using those same years to develop inner freedom. This story also reveals the building power of our mental habits. Each day the monk chose complaint over acceptance. he strengthened habits in his brain. Over 3 decades, these patterns became so deep that leaving seemed like the only option, when in reality, changing his perspective had always been available. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The monk's tragedy was his failure to recognize that his unhappiness was impermanent and changeable. Instead of working with his resistance, he fed it daily for 30 years until it consumed his entire spiritual journey. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace." The monk's 6 words over 30 years, all complaints, brought no peace to himself or others. Meanwhile, monks who used their practice to grow gratitude and acceptance found profound peace in the same conditions. Look deeply at your own relationship with current challenges. Where are you spending years complaining about circumstances that could be transformed through a shift in perspective? What would change if you used the same mental energy currently devoted to unhappiness to grow acceptance and inner peace? Tonight, as you notice the inevitable discomforts and imperfections of daily life, can you remember the monk's wasted decades? Can you choose gratitude over complaint? Acceptance over resistance? Understanding that your response to circumstances shapes your experience far more than the circumstances themselves. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The monastery offered every monk the same opportunity for peace and awakening. Some found it, others did not. Not because of external conditions, but because of the quality of attention they brought to those conditions. In every moment, we face the same choice the monk faced daily: to practice complaining or to practice happiness. Let us continue our journey with a story about maintaining inner balance regardless of external circumstances. This is the teaching of Master Hakuin and the power of, "Is that so?" Master Hakuin lived in a small village where he was deeply respected for his wisdom, compassion, and perfect character. For decades, he had kept a reputation as a pure and enlightened teacher, someone who had risen above ordinary human weaknesses and embodied the highest spiritual ideals. Villagers often brought their problems to him, seeking guidance and inspiration from his teachings and his perfect way of life. In this same village lived a beautiful young woman whose family was well known and respected. When she became pregnant outside of marriage, her condition caused a scandal that rippled through the close community. Her parents were furious and demanded to know who was responsible for bringing such shame upon their family. At first, the young woman refused to reveal the father's identity. She was protecting someone she loved, someone whose reputation and future would be destroyed if the truth came out. But as her parents' anger grew and the pressure became unbearable, she made a desperate decision. In a moment of panic and confusion, she pointed to the one person she thought could weather this storm better than her actual lover, the respected Master Hakuin. When her angry parents confronted the Zen master with their daughter's accusation, they expected protests of innocence, explanations, or at least some expression of shock at being falsely accused. Instead, Hakuin listened calmly to their angry words and simply replied, "Is that so?" His response only seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Surely, an innocent man would defend himself more strongly. The scandal exploded throughout the village. People who had looked up to Hakuin as a saint now whispered that he was a faker who had been living a lie. His reputation was destroyed overnight, and former students abandoned him in disgust and disappointment. When the child was born, the parents brought the baby directly to Hakuin. "This is your responsibility now," they declared bitterly. "Since you are the father, you must take care of this child." They thrust the infant into his arms and walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of a crime he had never committed. Again, Hakuin simply said, "Is that so?" and accepted the baby without protest or explanation. For many months, the former master cared for the child with tender attention. He fed the infant, changed diapers, walked the floors during sleepless nights, and provided all the love and care that any devoted parent would give. Neighbors who had once brought him gifts of food and respect now ignored him or spoke of him with dislike. He had lost his position, his reputation, and his job, but he continued to care for the child with peaceful dedication. Meanwhile, the young woman struggled with the weight of her lie. Watching the revered teacher suffer for her trick while caring lovingly for a child that wasn't his became unbearable. The guilt consumed her until she could no longer live with what she had done. Finally, she confessed the truth to her parents. The real father was a young man in the village whom she had been trying to protect. Her parents were horrified to learn what they had done to an innocent man. They rushed to Hakuin's simple home with many apologies. "Master, we have wronged you terribly," they said, bowing deeply. "Our daughter has confessed that you are not the father. We know now that you have suffered unfairly for our mistake. Please forgive us and allow us to take the child back to its real family." Hakuin listened to their apologies with the same calmness he had shown to their accusations. As he gently placed the baby in their arms, he offered the same response he had given throughout the entire ordeal. Is that so? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What comes from this story is the deep power of keeping inner balance regardless of how others see us or what circumstances life presents. Why do we allow external events and other people's opinions to determine our inner state? Zen Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from developing an unshakable center that remains stable whether we are being praised or blamed, honored or dishonored, treated fairly or unfairly. Hakuin's response, "Is that so?" represents a deep spiritual practice. He wasn't being uncaring or passive. He was demonstrating the ultimate non-attachment to reputation, status, and even justice itself. His consistent response showed that his sense of worth and purpose came from within rather than from external approval. Consider how differently most of us would react to false accusations, public shame, and complete loss of reputation. The natural human response is to defend ourselves, to fight against injustice, to demand that others see the truth. But Hakuin's approach reveals another possibility: meeting all circumstances with the same peaceful acceptance. This doesn't mean we should never defend ourselves or that we should passively accept all injustices. Hakuin's teaching is more subtle. He shows us that our inner peace doesn't have to depend on external circumstances being fair or good. We can keep our center regardless of how the world treats us. The Buddha taught, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." Hakuin's calmness protected him from the additional suffering that would have come from anger, self-pity, or desperate attempts to restore his reputation. While the situation was undoubtedly challenging, he didn't make the difficulty worse with emotional resistance. Look deeply at your own reactions to criticism, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. How much of your suffering comes from the actual events, and how much comes from your mental and emotional responses to those events? Hakuin's example suggests that we have far more control over the second source of suffering than the first. Tonight, as you encounter whatever judgments, misunderstandings, or unfair treatments life may bring, can you remember Master Hakuin's peaceful? Is that so? Can you find the space between what happens to you and how you respond? Discovering that your inner peace need not be held hostage by external circumstances. Buddha's wisdom teaches us peace comes from within. Do not look for it outside. True spiritual development isn't measured by how well life treats us, but by how gracefully we can meet whatever life brings. Maintaining our compassion, dignity, and inner peace regardless of whether the world recognizes our worth or understands our true nature. Let us continue our journey with a story about the transformative power of bravery and unconditional kindness. This is the tale of the thief and the Zen master. One quiet evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zen master Shicheri Kojin sat in his simple home, reading holy books. His voice flowed steadily through the peaceful rooms, each word a meditation, each breath a prayer. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as he absorbed himself completely in the sacred texts, finding deep peace in the familiar verses. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. The front door burst open with a violent crash, and a desperate man entered, holding a sharp sword that gleamed dangerously in the candlelight. His eyes were wild with worry, his clothes dirty and torn, his breathing heavy from running. He had clearly chosen this isolated house because he believed it would be an easy target. A peaceful monk would offer no resistance. "Money or your life?" the thief demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and aggression. He expected the old man to hide, to beg, to scramble frantically for whatever valuables he might have hidden away. But Shicheri didn't even look up from his book. His voice remained calm and steady as he continued reading for a moment before pausing to address the intruder. "Please don't disturb my practice," he said with the same gentle tone he might use to ask someone to close a door. "If you need money, help yourself. It's in that drawer over there." He pointed casually toward a simple wooden chest, then immediately returned to his reading, as if nothing unusual had happened. The thief stood frozen, his sword still raised, completely confused. In all his years of stealing, he had never encountered such a reaction. No fear, no begging, no anger, just matter of fact helpfulness. As if he were a neighbor who had stopped by to borrow something. Shaking his head in confusion, but going ahead with his business, the thief moved to the indicated drawer and began gathering the coins and small valuables he found there. The soft sound of the master's voice continued behind him, saying sacred words as peacefully as if he were alone. Just as the thief was preparing to leave with his stolen goods, the master's voice called out again. "Wet," Shichiri said, finally looking up from his book. "Please don't take everything. I need some of that money to pay my taxes tomorrow. Leave a little for me, won't you?" The thief stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who was being robbed, calmly working out the terms of his own robbery, as if they were conducting normal business. Almost without thinking, the thief returned some of the money to the drawer. As he turned to leave, certain that this strange encounter was finally over, the master's voice stopped him once more. "You took my money," Shichiri called out, his tone carrying a note of correction. "And you didn't even thank me. That's quite rude, don't you think?" This final comment left the thief completely speechless. His sword hand began to shake. Never in his most violent encounters had he been so thoroughly shaken. Here was a man who treated robbery as if it were a favor, who was more concerned about politeness than personal safety. "Thank you," the thief stammered, and then fled into the night as quickly as his legs would carry him. Later, when the thief was caught and confessed to many crimes, including the incident at Shichiri's house, the master was called as a witness. The court officials expected him to demand justice, to describe the terror and violation he had experienced. Instead, Shichiri spoke with the same calm clarity he had shown that evening. "This man did not steal anything from me," he testified. "I gave him the money freely. He even thanked me for it, though it took a little reminding." The thief, sitting in chains, felt something break open in his chest as he heard these words. This man had not only shown him extraordinary kindness in the moment of the crime, but was now protecting him from the consequences. For the first time in years, tears came to his eyes, not tears of self-pity or anger, but tears of recognition. He had encountered something he had never experienced before: love without conditions. Upon his release from prison, the former thief sought out the master and begged to become his student. Under Shichiri's patient guidance, he learned to grow the same fearless compassion he had witnessed that night. Years later, through dedicated practice and the master's unwavering belief in his potential for change, he achieved the deep peace and wisdom of enlightenment. As the Buddha observed, hatred does not cease by hatred but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What comes from this story is the revolutionary power of meeting violence with absolute peace, responding to taking with giving and answering fear with love. Why do we instinctively believe that force must be met with force? That aggression requires a defensive reaction? Zen Buddhism reveals that this pattern, while natural, often keeps the very conflicts it seeks to resolve going. When we respond to hostility with hostility, we simply increase the cycle of suffering. But when we respond with genuine kindness, not passive giving up, but active love, we create space for change that wouldn't otherwise exist. Look deeply at your own experience. When someone approaches you with anger, criticism, or demands, what is your automatic response? Most of us immediately mobilize our defenses, preparing to protect ourselves through fighting back or pulling away. But notice what happens in your body and mind during these defensive reactions. Does the tension decrease or increase? Does the conflict resolve or get worse? Shichiri's response demonstrates what Zen calls skillful means, acting from wisdom rather than habit. His bravery didn't come from being unaware of danger, but from understanding something deep about the nature of reality. He recognized that the thief's aggression came from desperation and suffering, not from pure evil. By refusing to see him as an enemy, Shichiri created the possibility for the thief to see himself differently. In Zen practice, we grow what might be called the courage of defenselessness. This doesn't mean being foolish about genuine danger or allowing ourselves to be harmed unnecessarily. Rather, it means developing the confidence to respond to difficult situations from our highest wisdom rather than our most basic instincts. The Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Shichiri showed all three in his meeting with the thief. He lived from complete presence, loved without conditions, and let go of any attachment to his possessions or even his personal safety. Consider the people in your life who challenge you: the difficult colleague, the critical family member, the aggressive driver in traffic. What would it mean to meet their energy with the same kind of fearless kindness Shichiri showed? Not by agreeing with them or giving in to their demands, but by refusing to match their level of reaction. By staying connected to your own center of peace, regardless of their behavior. Tonight, as you encounter your own moments of tension or conflict, can you remember the master who treated a robber as an honored guest? Can you find the space between what happens and how you respond, where choice lives? Where you can decide to meet aggression with peace, taking with giving, fear with love. Buddha's wisdom reminds us better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence is simply to remain unshakable in our commitment to kindness, knowing that love has a changing power that force can never match. Now let us explore a Zen story about the ultimate nature of spiritual truth. This is the meeting between the emperor and the master. In ancient China, there ruled an emperor known throughout the land for his devotion to the Buddhist path. Unlike rulers who concerned themselves only with wealth and land, this emperor had spent years studying sacred books, supporting monasteries, and seeking the deepest truths of existence. His palace library contained thousands of scrolls, and he had invited many learned monks to share their wisdom. When word reached him of a great Zen master, whose understanding went beyond normal knowledge, the emperor immediately sent an invitation. He longed to test his own understanding against this master's famous wisdom. The day of the master's arrival, the palace buzzed with excitement. The emperor had prepared complicated questions that would demonstrate both his devotion and deep grasp of Buddhist teachings. Surely such preparation would impress even the most skilled teacher. When the master entered the throne room, he appeared totally ordinary. His robes were simple and travel-worn, his manner humble yet alert. The emperor, seated on his golden throne beneath paintings of Buddhist saints, felt both excited and nervous. "Venerable master," the emperor began, his voice echoing through the vast hall decorated with precious statues and sacred symbols. "I have studied the Buddhist teachings for many years. I have built temples, supported monks, and devoted my life to understanding the sacred path. Now I ask you, what is the highest truth of the holy Buddhist teaching?" The emperor leaned forward expectantly, anticipating a deep speech that would confirm his years of study. Perhaps the master would talk about the Four Noble Truths or reveal some secret teaching passed down through generations. Instead, the master looked directly into the emperor's eyes with a gaze that seemed to see through all pretending. His response came quietly. Vast emptiness and not a trace of holiness. Silence filled the throne room. The emperor blinked, certain he had misheard. Where was the fancy explanation of the universe? Where were the references to sacred books and divine rules? "If there is no holiness," the emperor asked, his voice betraying confusion and worry, "then who or what are you? If there is no sacred truth to achieve, what makes you a master?" The emperor's questions carried the weight of years spent gathering spiritual knowledge and religious merit. He had built his identity around being a devout Buddhist ruler, and this master's words seemed to dissolve the foundation of that carefully built self-image. The master's response came with the same quiet directness. "I do not know." With these three simple words, the master had stripped away every concept, every identity, every claim to understanding that the emperor had gathered. The master left as simply as he had arrived, leaving the emperor in thoughtful silence. As the Buddha observed, "Those who think they know don't know. Those who know they don't know." This puzzling teaching points to the heart of Zen understanding. True wisdom begins not with gathering knowledge, but with recognizing the limits of thinking itself. The deeper teaching here shows us that spiritual seeking often becomes another form of grabbing. We collect teachings and insights like precious jewels, believing enlightenment lies in acquiring enough sacred knowledge. But ultimate truth cannot be owned or described in normal words. The master's statement of vast emptiness points to shunyata, often translated as emptiness. This doesn't mean nothing exists, but that nothing exists in the solid, independent way our thoughts assume. Everything happens connected to other things without a fixed center. This emptiness is not a concept to understand, but a reality to live. When the master says there is not a trace of holiness, he's not denying spiritual experience, but pointing to truth that goes beyond thinking in opposites, separating sacred from ordinary. The very search for holiness implies our present experience lacks something essential when completeness is already here. Consider how this teaching might light up your spiritual journey. Have you noticed how the mind tries to turn insights into possessions? We have powerful experiences and want to understand, label, and repeat them. Yet each time we grab, we move away from the simple presence that made them possible. The emperor represents the sincere seeker who has confused spiritual collecting with genuine awakening. His years of study weren't meaningless, but they had become obstacles to directly seeing what was always present. The master's "I do not know" represents the wisdom of "don't know" mind. This is not ignorance but open knowing that remains open to what is actually happening rather than filtering through ideas. From this mind, appropriate action comes without thinking getting in the way. In our culture that prizes knowledge, admitting "I don't know" feels like failure. But in Zen understanding, this admission becomes a doorway to fresh seeing. The expert mind sees what it expects. The beginner's mind sees what is actually there. Tonight, as you rest in this moment's presence, what would it be like to temporarily set aside everything you think you know about spirituality? Can you taste the freedom in not knowing? The space that opens when we stop trying to fill emptiness with ideas. As the Buddha taught, in the sky there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. The vast emptiness the master pointed to is infinitely spacious, containing all possibilities while being limited by none. In recognizing this emptiness as our true nature, we discover the most ordinary miracle, this moment exactly as it is, lacking nothing. Our next story reveals the difference between technical skill and true mastery of oneself. This is the lesson of the archer and the bridge. A young man had devoted years to perfecting his skill with the bow and arrow. Day after day he practiced in all weather conditions, his dedication absolute, his focus unshakable. His technique became perfect, his aim so exact that he rarely missed his target, even at great distances. Word of his remarkable ability spread throughout the region, and he began winning archery contests one after another, each victory feeding his growing pride and confidence. Flushed with success, and perhaps a bit drunk on his own reputation, the young archer decided to seek out the ultimate challenge. He had heard whispered stories of an old Zen master who lived high in the mountains, a man famous not only for his spiritual wisdom, but also for his legendary skill with the bow. I will challenge this old master, the young man thought, and when I defeat him, everyone will know that I am the greatest archer in all the land. He found the master's simple home and issued his challenge with the confidence of youth. "Old man," he said, perhaps more boldly than was respectful, "I have heard of your reputation with the bow. I challenge you to show whether your skill can match mine." The master, ancient eyes twinkling with quiet amusement, simply nodded his acceptance. The young archer immediately set up his demonstration. He selected a target at a huge distance, drew his bow with practiced exactness, and let loose his arrow. It flew straight and true, striking the exact center of the bullseye with a satisfying thud. Without pausing, he loaded a second arrow, drew, aimed, and fired again. This arrow split the first arrow down its center, a feat of such technical brilliance that few archers in the world could have done it. The young man turned to the master with obvious satisfaction, his chest puffed with pride. "There," he said, pointing toward his perfect demonstration. "Let's see if you can match that display of skill." The old master looked at the target, then at the young man, and smiled gently. But instead of drawing his own bow, he simply motioned for the archer to follow him. "Come," he said quietly. "Let us find a more suitable place for this demonstration." Curious about what the old man had in mind and confident that no location could lessen his superior abilities, the young archer followed the master up a winding mountain path. They climbed higher and higher, the air growing thinner, the path more dangerous, until finally they reached a place where the mountain was split by a deep pit. Crossing this terrifying gap was a single fallen log, weathered and narrow, that served as a bridge between the two sides. Far below, so far that the bottom disappeared into shadow, the pit opened like a hungry mouth. The slightest wrong step would mean certain death. Without a word, the old master calmly stepped out onto this dangerous bridge. His movements were slow, graceful, completely at ease despite the deadly danger. When he reached the center of the log, where it sagged slightly and swayed with his weight, He paused and turned to face a distant tree on the far side of the pit. Drawing his bow with the same casual exactness he might use in his own garden, the master took aim and released his arrow. It flew across the empty space and struck the distant tree with a clean, direct hit. Not necessarily more accurate than the young man's shots, but done under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced warrior. The master then gracefully stepped back onto solid ground and pointed toward the log bridge. "Now it is your turn," he said simply. The young archer approached the edge of the pit and looked down into the seemingly bottomless drop. His mouth went dry, his palms began to sweat, and his legs shook beneath him. The very thought of stepping onto that narrow, unstable bridge filled him with freezing terror. The technical skill that had made him so confident suddenly seemed useless in the face of this basic fear. He tried to force himself forward, but his body refused to obey. His hands shook so violently that he couldn't even grip his bow properly, much less aim with any exactness. The steady breathing and focused concentration that had served him so well in controlled conditions completely left him. The master watched this struggle with kind understanding. "You have developed great skill with your bow," he observed gently. "But you have little skill with the mind that lets loose the shot. As the Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think you become." This ancient wisdom lights up the difference between mastery of technique and mastery of the mind that uses the technique. Why do we so often mistake technical skill for true mastery? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to focus on external achievements while neglecting the inner development that makes those achievements meaningful. We perfect our skills in controlled environments, but discover our limits when facing uncertainty, danger, or real challenge. The young archer had indeed achieved remarkable technical skill, but only under ideal conditions. When his environment changed, when fear entered the equation, when the stakes became real, when his sense of safety was threatened, his carefully grown abilities disappeared entirely. His mastery was revealed to be shallow, dependent on external circumstances rather than inner stability. Consider your own areas of skill. How does your ability hold up under pressure? When faced with genuine stakes, unfamiliar circumstances, or emotional challenges, do your skills remain intact? Or do they crumble like the young archer's confidence on the bridge? In Zen practice, we grow what might be called unshakable presence, the ability to remain centered and effective regardless of external conditions. This doesn't mean getting rid of fear or challenge, but developing the inner stability that allows us to function skillfully even when afraid, uncertain, or under pressure. The master's demonstration wasn't about showing superior archery skills. It was about revealing the deep difference between skill that depends on perfect conditions and skill that emerges from inner mastery. His arrow didn't need to be more accurate than the young man's. It simply needed to be released from a place of genuine calmness. Zen Master Banki taught, "The unborn Buddha mind can handle any situation." This points to a quality of awareness that remains constant whether we are shooting at safe targets or standing on cliffs. It's the difference between confidence that comes from controlling our environment and confidence that comes from trusting our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace." One arrow shot from genuine presence and inner stability has more value than 1,000 arrows shot from ego and carefully controlled conditions. True mastery reveals itself not in perfect circumstances, but in our ability to maintain our center when everything around us is uncertain. Look deeply at your own relationship to challenge and fear. Where in your life do you perform well in safe, controlled environments, but struggle when stakes are raised or conditions become unpredictable? This isn't a failure. It's simply information about where your practice needs to deepen. Tonight, as you consider the various skills and abilities you've developed, can you tell the difference between those that depend on perfect conditions and those that remain stable under pressure? Can you sense the difference between the confidence that comes from avoiding challenge and the confidence that comes from meeting challenge with presence? Buddha's wisdom reminds us chaos is built into all created things. Work on with effort. Life is the bridge over the pit. Uncertain, sometimes frightening, always requiring us to find our balance. Not in the safety of solid ground, but in our ability to remain centered while walking through space. True mastery isn't about perfect aim. It's about maintaining our balance no matter where we find ourselves standing. Let us now explore a story about choice, responsibility, and the power we hold in every moment. This is the tale of the young man and the bird. A clever young student had grown tired of his teacher's seemingly wise responses to every question. He was convinced that the old master simply spoke in puzzles to appear deep, and he decided to create a test that would expose what he believed was mere pretending. After thinking for several days, he came up with what he thought was the perfect trap. One morning, the young man caught a small sparrow in the garden. The tiny bird shook in his cupped hands, its heart beating rapidly against his palms. He held it carefully behind his back as he approached his teacher, who was sitting peacefully in the morning sunlight, reading ancient books. "Master," the student called out with barely hidden excitement, "I have a question that will test your famous wisdom." The old teacher looked up from his reading with patient, gentle eyes. He had seen this look of playful confidence in many students over the years, and he understood the young man's need to challenge authority as part of his own growth and learning. "Please," the teacher said simply, "ask your question." The student stepped closer, keeping the bird hidden behind his back. "Master, I hold a small bird in my hands. Using your great wisdom, tell me, is this bird alive or dead?" The young man felt incredibly clever. He had created what he believed was an impossible situation for his teacher. If the master answered, "alive," he would quickly snap the bird's neck and reveal the dead creature, proving the teacher wrong. If the master answered dead, he would simply open his hands and let the living bird fly away, again proving the teacher's lack of true insight. Either way, the student was certain he would expose his teacher's supposed wisdom as nothing more than lucky guessing and confusing talk. He waited eagerly for the response that would give him the satisfaction of finally outsmarting the old man. The teacher sat quietly for a long moment, not trying to peer behind the student's back or gather more information. His eyes seemed to look not at the student but through him, as if seeing something far deeper than the simple trick being attempted. Finally, with a gentle smile that held both kindness and understanding, the master spoke. "The answer, my young friend, is in your hands." The student stood frozen, his mouth hanging open slightly. In 3 simple words, his elaborate trap had been completely taken apart. The teacher hadn't fallen for either option of the false choice. Instead, he had pointed to something far more deep, the basic truth that the student himself held the power to determine the outcome. The young man looked down at his hands, still cupped behind his back, feeling the tiny bird's rapid heartbeat against his palms. He realized with startling clarity that the master was right. The bird's fate had never depended on the teacher's answer or supposed wisdom. It had always been entirely in the student's control. More than that, he began to understand that this was true about far more than just this moment. The power to choose life or death, creation or destruction, kindness or cruelty, all of it was always in his hands in every situation, every day. Slowly, the young man brought his hands forward and opened them. The small bird sat still for just a moment as if gathering itself, then spread its wings and flew into the blue sky, disappearing among the trees. Buddha's wisdom teaches us we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. This ancient wisdom lights up the profound responsibility that comes with conscious choice and the recognition that we are always the builders of our own experience. Why do we so often look outside ourselves for answers that can only be found within? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to seek authority figures who will tell us what to do, what to think, what to choose. But the deepest teaching is that true wisdom cannot be given from one person to another. It can only be discovered through our own conscious engagement with life. The student's question seemed to be about the teacher's insight, but it was actually about his own power. He was so focused on proving the master wrong that he almost missed the deep truth being offered. That every moment presents us with choices that shape not only our immediate circumstances, but our character and future. Consider your own daily decisions, both large and small. How often do you wait for someone else to tell you what the right choice is? How frequently do you seek permission, approval, or guidance for decisions that ultimately rest entirely in your own hands? The young man's bird represents all the power we hold but sometimes fail to recognize. In our relationships, careers, and spiritual development, we constantly face moments where we hold something precious in our hands: the well-being of others, our own honesty, opportunities for growth or destruction. The outcome depends not on external circumstances or other people's wisdom, but on what we choose to do with the power we possess. The master's response reveals something crucial about real teaching. True teachers don't give answers. They point us back to our own capacity for wisdom. They help us recognize the choices we are already making and the power we already possess rather than encouraging dependence on their authority. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck said, "We are always in choice even when we think we're not." The bird in the student's hands represents all the moments when we convince ourselves we have no options, no power, no responsibility. But awareness always involves choice, and choice always involves responsibility. Look deeply at a current challenge in your life. Where are you waiting for someone else to provide answers, solutions, or direction? What would change if you fully recognize that the power to shape the outcome is already in your hands? This doesn't mean you have control over all external circumstances, but you always have choice about how you respond. The Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think you become. Every thought, every intention, every action is like the student's choice with the bird, an opportunity to create life or death, beauty or suffering, wisdom or ignorance. The answer is always in our hands. Tonight, as you consider the various situations in your life where you seek guidance or feel powerless, can you sense the truth the Master was pointing to? Can you feel the weight of the choices you carry every day? Not as a burden, but as the fundamental dignity of conscious existence. As the Buddha observed, no one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. The bird flies free not because of the teacher's wisdom, but because of the student's choice. In recognizing our own power to choose life over death, kindness over cruelty, truth over lies, we discover that the answer to every important question has always been in our hands. Let us now turn to a tale about the courage to trust life's current. This is the story of the Crystal River. In the depths of a great crystal river, where water flowed clear as mountain air, there lived an entire village of small creatures. The river's current moved above them like a gentle breath, carrying the wisdom of countless springs and distant seas. Young and old, rich and poor, all made their home along the sandy bottom. Each creature grasping tightly to stones, branches, and roots. For generations, holding on had been their way of survival. Every creature learned from birth to wrap their arms and legs around river rocks and fallen wood. Hold on, the elders would say. The current is dangerous. It will sweep you away to places unknown. Safety lies in staying exactly where you are. But one small creature grew tired of this endless holding. Day after day, he watched the current flow overhead, seeing how it moved with such purpose and grace. While his neighbors complained about the effort required to maintain their grip, he found himself wondering what it might feel like to trust that flowing water. "I am tired of holding on," he announced one morning. "Though I cannot see where it leads, I trust that the current knows its destination. I shall let go and allow it to carry me where it will. For I fear that if I continue holding on, I shall die of boredom before I ever truly live." The other creatures gasped in horror. "Fool," they cried. "Let go, and that current will tumble you violently across the rocks below. You will be battered and broken, dying far more quickly than any boredom could kill you." But the small creature had made his decision. Taking one last look at his neighbors, he released his grip on the familiar stone. Immediately, the current seized him, and just as the others had predicted, he was tumbled and tossed across the rocky bottom. His small body struck stone after stone, each hit bringing pain he had never experienced while safely holding on. Yet something remarkable began to happen. As the creature continued to give in to the current's power, refusing to grab for new anchors despite his pain, the water gradually lifted him higher from the dangerous bottom. The tumbling stopped. The rocks could no longer reach him. Now he flowed with the current itself, no longer fighting its direction, but becoming one with its movement. As he traveled downstream, creatures in distant parts witnessed something they had never seen. Here was one of their own kind. Yet he appeared to be flying through the water, moving with the graceful power of the current itself. "See a miracle," they called out. "A creature like ourselves, yet he flies. Surely he is a hero come to save us all." The flowing creature heard their cries and felt compassion for their misunderstanding. "I am no more hero than any of you," he called back. "The river delights in lifting us all free, if only we dare to let go. Our true work is not holding on to the bottom, but embracing this journey, this grand adventure of trust and flow." But the creatures only cried louder, "Hero, savior!" Even as they spoke, They tightened their grips on rocks and roots. They watched until he disappeared around a bend, then began creating legends about the miraculous savior who had briefly graced their village. Buddha's wisdom reminds us you only lose what you cling to. This ancient teaching lights up the deep puzzle at the heart of human experience. We spend our lives grabbing for security and control, believing that our safety depends on holding tight to familiar circumstances. Yet in this very grabbing, we create the suffering we seek to avoid. Why do we cling so desperately when the current offers to carry us toward unknown adventures? Zen Buddhism reveals that from early childhood, we learn the known is safe and the unknown dangerous. This training becomes a spiritual obstacle when it prevents growth beyond familiar limits. We also suffer from the illusion of control, believing that by grabbing circumstances, relationships, and identities we can stop the natural flow of change. This creates huge tension because it puts us in opposition to reality itself. Life is constant movement, and when we resist this truth, we exhaust ourselves fighting currents far more powerful than our individual will. Consider the areas of your life where you find yourself holding on. Perhaps it's a relationship that has outgrown its original form, a career that no longer brings joy, or an image of yourself that now limits your growth. The current of change will flow whether we resist it or not. Our choice is whether to exhaust ourselves in useless fighting or discover the grace available in conscious surrender. The Buddha said, "Nothing is permanent except change." Water doesn't fight the mountainside. It finds the natural pathway down. When we learn to move with life's current rather than against it, we discover easy effectiveness that stiff resistance can never achieve. Tonight, as you rest in this moment's stillness, what might you be ready to release? Perhaps it's a worry about tomorrow's challenges, an anger from yesterday's disappointments, or a way of defining yourself that has grown too small. Can you feel into the current of this moment's life and trust its direction? As the Buddha taught, let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Relax right now and rest. In this trust, we discover that the current we feared would destroy us is actually the very force that can carry us home to our true nature. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about the puzzle of absolute truth. This is the lesson of the hermit and the contradictory teaching. A famous Zen master had gained a reputation throughout the region for his deep insights and life-changing teachings. Students came from far and wide to study under his guidance, each hoping to receive the wisdom that would lead them to enlightenment. Among all his teachings, there was one that he considered his greatest and most basic insight. Buddha is your own mind. The master would tell his students with absolute certainty. This is the highest truth I can share with you. Stop looking outside yourself for what you already have. Stop seeking in temples and books what is already present in your own consciousness. Buddha is your own mind. Realize this and you will be free. One young monk was so deeply moved by this teaching that it seemed to light up everything he had been searching for. The idea that enlightenment wasn't something to be gotten from external sources, but was actually the very nature of his own mind struck him as the most profound truth he had ever encountered. This insight felt so complete and revolutionary that he decided it deserved his total dedication. Leaving the monastery and his fellow students behind, the monk retreated deep into the wilderness to meditate on this great teaching. He found a remote cave in the mountains where he could practice without any distractions or influences from the outside world. There, surrounded by the silence of nature, he spent 20 years in alone thinking, probing every aspect of the master's words. During those 2 decades of hiding away, he explored the teaching from every possible angle. He meditated on the nature of mind, examined his own consciousness, and worked to fully realize the truth that Buddha was indeed his own mind. The years passed in deep practice as he sought to live this understanding completely. One day, a traveling monk happened to pass through the forest near his cave. The hermit, excited to meet another student after so many years of solitude, came out from his retreat to greet the visitor. Through their conversation, he learned that this traveler had also studied under the same famous master. "How wonderful to meet a fellow student," the hermit exclaimed. "Please tell me what you know of our master's greatest teaching. I have spent 20 years thinking about his deep insight that Buddha is your own mind." The traveling monk's eyes lit up with recognition, but his response was entirely unexpected. "Ah, yes, the master has indeed been very clear about this subject. he said enthusiastically. His greatest teaching, the one he emphasizes above all others, is this: Buddha is not your own mind. The hermit stood speechless, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. After 20 years of dedicated practice, based on what he believed was the master's highest teaching, he was now hearing the exact opposite presented with equal certainty by another student of the same teacher. As the Buddha taught, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Here we discover that even the most profound teachings are simply tools for awakening, not final truths to be grabbed and defended. Why do we cling so tightly to particular versions of truth when reality itself goes beyond all concepts? Zen Buddhism reveals that our attachment to specific teachings, no matter how deep, can become obstacles to the very understanding those teachings were meant to inspire. The hermit's confusion points to a basic aspect of Zen teaching. Masters often use contradictory teachings to prevent students from turning insights into stiff beliefs. The purpose isn't to provide a final answer, but to exhaust the mind's tendency to grab and label, creating space for direct realization beyond all words and ideas. Both teachings, Buddha is your mind, and Buddha is not your mind, serve important functions depending on the student's needs and understanding. For someone lost in external seeking, Buddha is your mind, redirects attention inward. For someone attached to the idea of possessing Buddha nature, Buddha is not your mind, dissolves that subtle grabbing. Consider your own relationship with spiritual or thinking teachings. How often do you turn helpful pointers into absolute truths that must be defended against opposite perspectives? The hermit's 20-year retreat, while dedicated and honest, demonstrates how even correct understanding can become a form of limitation when held too tightly. In Zen practice, we learn to hold all teachings lightly, like medicine that serves its purpose and then is no longer needed. The master's apparent contradiction wasn't inconsistency, but wise methods. Using whatever approach would most effectively dissolve each student's particular form of confusion. Zen Master Wangpo taught, the foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. The hermit had become so invested in thinking about the teaching that he may have lost touch with the direct experience it was meant to point to. The Buddha said, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down, but after observation and analysis. When you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. This teaching applies even to the Buddha's own words and the most respected Zen teachings. Truth isn't found in the perfect wording, but in the awakening that goes beyond all wordings. Look deeply at your own cherished beliefs and understandings. Where might you be holding on to insights so tightly that they've become barriers to deeper realization? What would it mean to receive all teachings as temporary tools rather than final truths? Tonight, as you consider the various teachings and ideas that have shaped your understanding, can you remember the hermit's surprise at discovering contradiction where he expected confirmation? Can you hold your most treasured insights lightly enough that they remain alive and useful rather than becoming stiff rules? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, truth has no form. How can it be held? Whether Buddha is your mind or not your mind, whether teachings are correct or incorrect, the reality they point toward remains free of all concepts, available in this moment to anyone willing to look beyond the finger to see the moon itself. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about how customs can outlive their purpose. This is the lesson of the monastery cat and the scholars who forgot. In a peaceful monastery nestled in the mountains, a community of monks dedicated themselves to regular meditation practice. Every evening, as the sun set behind the peaks and shadows grew long across the temple grounds, they would gather in the meditation hall for their most important practice session of the day. This was a time of deep silence and inner thinking that had been maintained for generations. However, the monastery was also home to a particularly noisy cat who had made the temple grounds his territory. This cat had developed the unfortunate habit of appearing during the evening meditation sessions, meowing loudly, knocking over water bowls, and generally creating disturbances that made it difficult for the monks to maintain the focused attention their practice required. Night after night, the monks would attempt to settle into deep meditation, only to be interrupted by the cat's antics. Some tried to ignore the interruptions. Others attempted to gently shoo the animal away. but nothing seemed to work consistently. The cat seemed to have a strange ability to choose the most bad moments for his loudest and most distracting behavior. Finally, the spiritual teacher who led the community decided that practical action was needed. Rather than allowing the evening practice to continue being disturbed, he instructed his students to gently capture the cat before each meditation session and tie him securely in a corner of the hall where he could do no harm. This simple solution proved effective. The cat, though present, could no longer disturb the monk's concentration. Years passed peacefully with this arrangement. The evening meditation sessions proceeded without interruption. The monks deepened their practice, and the cat seemed content enough with his tied position during the evening hours. This became the established routine that everyone accepted as normal and necessary. When the old teacher eventually died, the monks naturally continued all the practices he had established, including the evening tying of the cat. After all, this had been part of their master's wisdom, a tradition he had started for important spiritual reasons. They didn't question whether the practice was still necessary. It had simply become a key part of their evening routine. In time, the original cat also died, having lived a full life in the monastery. The monks, now thoroughly convinced that having a tied cat was essential to proper meditation practice, went to great lengths to get another cat specifically for this purpose. They searched until they found a suitable replacement and continued the tradition without interruption. Generations of monks came and went, each learning from those before them that tying a cat during evening meditation was a crucial element of their spiritual practice. None questioned why this was necessary. It was simply how things had always been done in their tradition. Centuries later, learned students of the spiritual teacher wrote long papers about the religious importance of tying up a cat for meditation practice. They developed complicated theories about the symbolic meaning of the tied cat, its representation of taming the wild mind, and its importance in creating the proper spiritual atmosphere for thinking. Buddha's wisdom teaches us: do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. This tale shows how easily practical solutions can transform into meaningless rituals when we stop questioning their original purpose. Why do we continue practices long after their usefulness has ended simply because they've become traditional? Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of understanding the spirit behind forms rather than blindly following handed-down customs that may no longer serve their intended function. The original teacher's decision to tie the cat was purely practical, a simple solution to a specific problem. But over time, this practical measure became ritual, then holy, then analyzed as if it contained deep spiritual meaning that had always been on purpose. Consider the various traditions, rules, and customs in your own life, both personal and cultural. How many of these practices do you follow simply because that's how it's always been done, rather than because they serve a current purpose? The monastery's cat represents all the meaningless forms we maintain out of habit rather than wisdom. This teaching applies to spiritual practices, workplace procedures, family traditions, and social customs. Over time, solutions to specific problems can become stiff requirements that last long after the original problems have disappeared. What began as a wise method becomes empty ritual. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between the finger pointing at the moon and the moon itself, between the forms that serve awakening and awakening itself. The tied cat was never the point. Peaceful meditation was the point. But later generations lost sight of this distinction. The Buddha said, "My teaching is like a raft. It is for crossing over, not for holding on to." The tying tradition represents what happens when we turn temporary rafts into permanent shrines, mistaking the means for the end. Look deeply at the various practices and traditions you maintain. Which ones still serve their original purpose, and which ones have become empty forms you follow out of habit? What would it mean to honor the spirit of these practices, while remaining flexible about their forms? The scholars who wrote papers about the cat's religious importance weren't intentionally creating false ideas. They genuinely believed they were keeping important wisdom, but their analysis was built on a foundation they didn't understand, leading to complicated explanations of something that had never been intended as spiritual practice. Tonight, as you consider the various routines, traditions, and practices in your life, can you remember the original cat and the practical problem it solved? Can you tell the difference between forms that still serve their purpose and those that have become meaningless repetition. As the Buddha observed, believe nothing merely because you have been told it. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is helpful to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. True spiritual maturity involves continuously examining our practices to ensure they serve their intended purpose, rather than simply preserving forms because they've become familiar. Let us continue with a story about the limits of understanding and the honesty of not knowing. This is the teaching of the Emperor and Master Gudo, the Emperor of Japan. A man used to receiving clear answers from his advisors and scholars, had arranged a private meeting with Master Gudo, one of the most respected Zen teachers in the land. The emperor came with genuine curiosity about spiritual matters, particularly questions about life, death, and what might lie beyond ordinary understanding. Seated in the formal room where matters of state were usually discussed, the emperor felt comfortable asking even the most deep questions to this famous master. After all, if anyone would possess answers to life's deepest mysteries, surely it would be an enlightened Zen teacher who had spent decades in thinking and practice. Master Gudo, the emperor, began with the directness that comes from a lifetime of authority. I have a question that has troubled many great minds throughout history. What happens to a man of enlightenment after death? Surely someone of your spiritual level would understand such matters. The emperor expected a profound speech on the nature of consciousness after physical death, perhaps insights into rebirth, karma, or the eternal nature of enlightened awareness. He was prepared to hear about subtle realms, the melting of individual consciousness into cosmic unity, or other high teachings that would satisfy his curiosity about this ultimate mystery. Instead, Master Gudo looked at the emperor with complete calmness and gave the most honest answer possible. How should I know? The emperor was shocked. Here was a master respected throughout the land for his wisdom, essentially admitting ignorance about what seemed like a basic spiritual question. But master, the emperor pressed, somewhat unbelieving, you are an enlightened teacher. Surely you must have special knowledge about such things. Gudo's response was immediate and perfectly logical. Yes, sir, but not a dead one. The simplicity of this exchange contains a deep teaching about the nature of genuine wisdom and the difference between real understanding and pretended knowledge. As the Buddha taught, I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance. This ancient wisdom lights up the deep honesty that marks true spiritual maturity. The willingness to admit the limits of one's knowledge, rather than pretending to understand what cannot be known from one's current position. Why do we expect spiritual teachers to have answers to questions that can only be resolved through direct experience? Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between book knowledge and lived understanding, between what we can guess about and what we can actually know. Master Gudo's response wasn't a failure of wisdom, but a demonstration of it. He refused to engage in guessing about experiences he hadn't had, even when pressed by someone in a position of great authority. His honesty revealed more wisdom than any complicated theory about post-death consciousness could have provided. Consider how often in daily life we pretend to know things we don't actually know. Whether it's offering confident opinions about complex social issues, giving definitive advice about other people's relationships, or claiming certainty about uncertain outcomes, we often feel pressured to appear knowledgeable rather than admitting the limits of our understanding. The emperor's assumption that enlightenment should include knowledge about death reflects a common wrong idea about spiritual development. We imagine that awakening provides a complete database of cosmic information rather than a fundamental shift in how we relate to not knowing. In Zen practice, we grow what Suzuki Roshi called don't know mind, a state of open awareness that doesn't need to fill every gap in understanding with theories or beliefs. This isn't ignorance, but a wise recognition that direct experience is more valuable than second-hand information. Zen Master Linji taught, there is nothing special to do, nothing special to learn. Enlightenment doesn't grant supernatural knowledge about matters beyond ordinary experience. A living master knows about living. What happens after death remains in the realm of guessing until one actually dies. The Buddha said, believe nothing merely because you have been told it, but whatsoever after due examination and analysis you find to be conducive to the good, the benefit, the welfare of all beings. That doctrine believe and cling to. Even the Buddha encouraged direct investigation over accepting claims based on authority. Gudo's teaching reveals the freedom that comes from releasing the need to have opinions about everything. How much mental energy do we waste building theories about things we cannot possibly know? How much suffering comes from worrying about scenarios we can only imagine? Look deeply at your own relationship with not knowing. Where do you pretend certainty to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty? What would change if you could say, "I don't know," with the same confidence that Master Gudo displayed? The emperor sought knowledge about death from someone who was brightly alive. But true wisdom might be found not in gathering information about future experiences, but in fully engaging with present reality. The mystery of death is honored not by pretending to solve it, but by living authentically in the face of it. Tonight, as you encounter questions about the future, about others' motivations, or about cosmic mysteries, can you remember Master Gudo's honest simplicity? Can you find the courage to admit when you don't know? Discovering that don't know mind might be wiser than all our clever theories. Buddha's wisdom reminds us the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. In a world full of false certainties and confident ignorance, the Master's honest, "How should I know?" points toward a more genuine relationship with mystery, one that honors what cannot be known, while fully embracing what can be directly experienced. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about true spiritual power. This is the tale of the miracle of ordinary living. At Ryuman Temple, the famous Zen master Bankai was sharing the teachings with a large gathering of devoted students. The hall was filled with people sitting in quiet attention, absorbing his simple yet profound teachings about living with natural awareness. The evening light came through the temple windows, creating an atmosphere of peace and thought. In the middle of his speech, a disturbance arose near the back of the hall. A Shinshu priest whose own temple had been losing followers to Bankai's growing reputation pushed his way through the crowd with obvious agitation. His face was red with jealousy, and his movements were sharp with competitive energy. Bankai paused his teaching and looked toward the noise with patient curiosity. "What is this noise that interrupts our evening together?" he asked gently, his voice carrying no irritation despite the disruption. The priest stood up boldly, his voice rising above the whisper of the crowd. "The founder of our sect," he bragged loudly, had such miraculous powers that he held a brush in his hand on one bank of the river. His assistant held up a paper on the other bank, and the teacher wrote the holy name of Amida through the air. "Can you do such a wonderful thing?" The gathered students turned their attention between the challenging priest and their teacher, curious how Bankai would respond to this test of his spiritual abilities. Some expected a display of supernatural powers. Others wondered if their master would engage in debate. Bankai smiled with the gentle amusement of someone who understood the priest's confusion completely. "Perhaps your fox can perform that trick," he replied lightly. "But that is not the manner of Zen. My miracle is that when I feel hungry, I eat, and when I feel thirsty, I drink." The temple fell into deep silence as the simple depth of these words settled into the hearts of those present. The priest, expecting magical displays, found himself face to face with a teaching about the extraordinary nature of ordinary experience. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom lights up how real spiritual power shows not in supernatural displays, but in complete presence to what is actually happening. Why do we seek the miraculous outside of our immediate experience? Zen Buddhism reveals our tendency to skip over the deep simplicity of life in search of dramatic spiritual experiences. We imagine enlightenment as something exotic, supernatural, or removed from daily existence when in truth, it's the ability to be fully present to whatever is happening. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding that awareness itself is the ultimate miracle. The fact that you can taste food, feel thirst, hear these words, or experience any feeling at all is more extraordinary than any magic trick. Yet, we take these everyday miracles for granted while seeking special powers that would somehow prove our spiritual development. Look deeply at your own experience right now. Can you feel the miracle of breathing without having to think about it? The wonder of your heart beating steadily, the extraordinary fact that light enters your eyes and somehow becomes the picture of these words. These are the real miracles available in every moment. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi taught, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This puzzle points to the Zen understanding that we don't need to become someone special to access spiritual truth. We need to fully inhabit who we already are. The Buddha taught, there are only two mistakes one can make along the road to truth: not going all the way, and not starting. The path is not about developing supernatural abilities, but about going all the way into the simple reality of this moment, starting exactly where you are with whatever you're experiencing right now. Consider how the priest's question revealed his own spiritual greed. The belief that wisdom can be measured by impressive displays, rather than by the quality of one's presence. This trap catches many seekers who mistake the extraordinary for the spiritual, when the truly spiritual is found in bringing complete attention to the ordinary. Tonight, as you eat your next meal or drink a glass of water, can you taste the miracle that Bankai pointed to? Can you experience the wonder of simple biological processes that sustain your life? As the Buddha said, the way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart. The miracles we seek are not above us, but within the simple reality of being alive. Our next story reveals how freedom comes not from achieving something new, but from recognizing what was never born and can never die. This is the teaching of freedom from birth and death. In a quiet monastery garden where cherry blossoms drifted on the spring breeze, a dedicated student named Goshu approached the wise Zen master Yu. For years, Goshu had been practicing meditation, studying texts, and following all the ordered methods of spiritual development. Yet despite his honest efforts, he felt no closer to the enlightenment he desperately sought. Goshu bowed respectfully before his teacher, his face showing the strain of long spiritual seeking. Master, I have been studying Zen for many years, following every instruction, sitting in meditation daily, reading the ancient texts, but I have not yet succeeded. I feel as lost as when I began. Please give me some guidance. What am I missing? What more must I do? Yu looked at his earnest student with compassion. Seeing the weight of spiritual ambition that had become a burden rather than a path to freedom, he understood that Goshu's very effort to achieve enlightenment had become the obstacle to recognizing his natural wakefulness. There is no secret trick to Zen study, Yu said simply. It's just a matter of freedom from birth and death. Goshu's forehead wrinkled with confusion. This answer seemed to make his quest even more hard. Master, how does one pass through birth and death to freedom? That sounds like the most difficult task of all. If I cannot even quiet my mind for a few minutes, how can I transcend birth and death? Yu's eyes brightened and he raised his voice with sudden intensity. Your every passing thought is birth and death. At these words, something shifted dramatically in Goshu's understanding. Like a curtain suddenly lifted, he saw that what he had been seeking as some future achievement was actually the very nature of his present experience. The constant rising and passing away of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, this endless flow was not something to escape, but the very freedom he had been chasing. Goshu went into joy, feeling as if he had put down a heavy burden he didn't even realize he had been carrying. The relief was deep and immediate. All his years of struggling to become something special dissolved into the recognition that he had never been anything other than the aware space in which all experience appears and disappears. As the Buddha observed, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. What comes from this story is the recognition that we suffer not because we lack something, but because we don't recognize the freedom that is our basic nature. Why do we carry the heavy burden of spiritual becoming? Zen Buddhism points to our identification with the content of our mind, rather than the mind itself. We mistake ourselves for the stream of thoughts, emotions, and sensations instead of recognizing ourselves as the aware space in which this stream flows. Every thought that rises is born. Every thought that fades away dies. Every emotion emerges from nowhere and dissolves back into nowhere. Every sensation appears and disappears. This constant birth and death happening in awareness is not a problem to solve, but the very movement of life itself. The deeper understanding here reveals that what we call birth and death are simply names we give to the natural flowing of experience. When we identify with the flow, we suffer the worry of constant change. When we recognize ourselves as the awareness in which the flow appears, we discover unshakable peace. Zen Master Huangpo taught, your everyday mind, that is the way. This points to the extraordinary fact that the enlightenment we seek is not hidden in special states, but in the ordinary awareness that knows every state. The same awareness that knows anxiety also knows peace. The same awareness that knows confusion also knows clarity. The Buddha said, in the sky there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds, and then believe them to be true. Our spiritual seeking often creates the very problem it attempts to solve by imagining that some states of consciousness are spiritual, while others are mundane. Consider how much energy you invest in trying to have better thoughts, more peaceful emotions, or more pleasant experiences. Each effort to improve the content of consciousness strengthens the belief that you are that content, rather than the awareness that witnesses it all with equal presence. In Japanese Zen, there is a teaching called just sitting, or shikantaza. This practice involves recognizing that the sitting itself is enlightenment rather than a method to achieve enlightenment. Similarly, your current awareness exactly as it is the freedom you seek, rather than a stepping stone to freedom. Tonight, as thoughts rise and pass away in your awareness, can you recognize the birth and death that you pointed to? Can you see that you are not the thoughts that come and go, but the unchanging awareness in which they appear? As the Buddha taught, all conditioned things are temporary. Work out your freedom with effort. The freedom is not in perfecting the conditioned, but in recognizing the unconditioned awareness that you already are. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about changing our relationship with suffering. This is the tale of the salt and the lake. In a quiet monastery nestled among rolling hills, there lived an aging master known for his patience and wisdom. Among his students was a young apprentice whose heart had become heavy with complaints about life's difficulties. Each morning, the apprentice would arrive with fresh complaints. "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today my back aches from the hard floor. When will this suffering end?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had listed every small discomfort until they had grown into an overwhelming burden. The master listened with endless patience. But as days turned to weeks, he recognized that words alone would not shift his student's perspective. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight streamed through their simple home, the master made an unusual request. "My dear student," he said gently, "I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me some salt. Just a handful will do." The apprentice, puzzled by the simple task, nonetheless obeyed. He returned with cupped palms containing rough white crystals. "No," the master instructed, producing a small glass of water. "Place all of that salt into this glass and drink it." The young man hesitated. "Master, that seems like far too much salt for such a small amount of water." "Trust the process," the master replied. The apprentice poured the salt into the glass, watching the crystals dissolve into a cloudy, unappetizing mixture. He lifted it to his lips and took a large gulp, immediately making a face as the intensely bitter taste filled his mouth. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter," the apprentice spat. "Terribly, overwhelmingly bitter. I can barely stand it." The master chuckled softly. "Excellent. Now bring that same amount of salt and come with me." Together they walked in thoughtful silence, until they reached the shores of a clean mountain lake. The water stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where earth ended and heaven began. "Now," the master said, "place this handful of salt into the lake." The apprentice walked into the shallow water and opened his hands, watching as the salt crystals scattered across the lake's surface, quickly dissolving without leaving any visible trace. "Drink from the lake," the master instructed. The young man cupped the lake water in his hands and brought it to his lips. The water was clean, refreshing, with the pure taste of mountain streams. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Much better," the apprentice replied, genuinely surprised. "Clean and pure." "Do you taste the salt?" the master asked gently. The student paused, paying careful attention. "No," he said slowly. "I don't taste any salt at all." The master sat beside his student on a smooth stone at the water's edge. His weathered hands reached out to hold the young man's hands in deep kindness. "My dear student," the master said, "the pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. The amount of pain in existence remains constant, but the amount of bitterness we experience depends entirely on the container we put that pain into." The apprentice listened with new understanding. "When you are in pain," the master continued, "the only thing you can truly control is your response. You can choose to be a small glass where every grain of salt overwhelms your senses. Or you can choose to make your sense of things larger, to become like this vast lake where the same salt dissolves harmlessly into something much greater." The master paused. "Stop being a glass, my friend. Become a lake," the Buddha once said. Pain is certain. Suffering is optional. This basic teaching reveals the heart of our relationship with difficulty. We cannot remove the challenges woven into human existence, but we have tremendous power over how that pain affects us. What comes from this story is understanding about awareness itself. Our awareness is not fixed in size. It can shrink into the narrow limits of a glass where every difficulty looms enormous. Or it can expand into the openness of a lake where the same difficulties become manageable. Why do we often choose to be the glass rather than the lake? First is our tendency toward pain focus, becoming so focused on discomfort that it fills our entire awareness. Second is our habit of making up stories, taking a single painful event and creating detailed stories about how unfair life is. Third is the comparing mind, measuring our pain against an imaginary standard of how life should be. The lake perspective doesn't make light of real pain or suggest giving up. Rather, it offers a wise way of relating to inevitable challenges that doesn't add unnecessary suffering to them. From lake consciousness, we can respond to problems more creatively because we are not overwhelmed. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. From the lake perspective, we remember that everything arises and passes away within the vast space of awareness. Today's crisis becomes tomorrow's memory. We become a lake through practices that naturally expand awareness. Meditation teaches us to rest in open presence. Gratitude helps us notice experiences beyond immediate difficulties. Service reminds us that our pain is part of shared human experience. Tonight, as you reflect on current challenges, can you sense the difference between experiencing them from glass consciousness versus lake consciousness? What would it feel like to allow your awareness to expand beyond the immediate strength of difficulties to include the vast context of this moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and observe it. If your mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he speaks of is not the absence of salt, but the space to hold it wisely. In becoming lakes rather than glasses, we discover that pain can become a gateway to deeper compassion and freedom. Tonight, as we complete our journey through these sacred stories, can you sense that the peace you have been seeking is not separate from this very moment of awareness? Can you feel how the wisdom in these ancient tales is not distant, but immediately present in your direct experience right now? As the Buddha observed, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. The ultimate truth is not hidden in distant monasteries or ancient scrolls, but in the miracle of ordinary awareness, the silent witness that has been present throughout our entire journey together. As we draw our time together to a close, let us reflect on the path we have traveled through these timeless teachings. Each story has offered a unique piece of understanding, yet all point to the same essential truth that peace, clarity, and awakening are available here and now, not in some distant future or special circumstance. We learn to distinguish between real love and attachment disguised as desire, discovering that true compassion serves another's highest good, even when it means dissolving pleasant illusions. We explored how genuine spiritual development must include the capacity for warm human connection, not cold distance from life's complexities. We witnessed how fear transforms into power when we identify with something larger than our worried self-conscious mind, becoming the ocean itself rather than a swimmer afraid of drowning. We discovered the difference between having and being, seeing that the greatest treasures cannot be owned but shine freely for all who have eyes to see. And we encountered the truth that the path to awakening rarely follows normal forms. Learning to extend kindness to those whose spiritual seeking has led them down difficult paths. Each tale has been a doorway into deeper understanding. We have discovered that our reactions often say more about us than about the situations we face. We have learned that the present moment contains joys as sweet as any strawberry, even when we are hanging between the tigers of past regret and future anxiety. We have seen how adding mental suffering to inevitable pain only multiplies our difficulties, and how practicing mindful awareness allows us to meet life's challenges with greater wisdom. The Buddha taught, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. As you continue on your own path of awakening, may the truths shown in these stories remain with you, not as concepts to remember, but as living invitations to experience life with greater presence, kindness, and wisdom. The cricket still sings in the temple, waiting for those with ears to hear. The moon still shines freely for all who would receive its light. The waves still roll with unstoppable power for those who would claim their natural strength. These teachings are not old things of the past, but eternal principles that speak to the deepest longings of the human heart. Tonight, as your body settles into rest and your breathing naturally deepens, know that you carry within you all the wisdom these stories have revealed. The peace you have touched through these tales is your own true nature, always available, never absent, patiently waiting for your recognition. Thank you for sharing this sacred journey. May you rest peacefully, waking refreshed, and carrying these ancient teachings into the light of a new day. May the wisdom of countless generations guide your steps and the compassion of the Buddha light your way. Sleep well, friend.